A successful black CEO faces unwarranted racism when he's wrongly accused of being suspicious while dining in a small-town diner. The racist assumptions and treatment he experiences are fueled by his luxury car and appearance, triggering a tense confrontation. As he is unjustly humiliated and questioned, the CEO remains calm and dignified despite the blatant prejudice from those around him. The story highlights systemic bias, forcing the audience to confront uncomfortable truths about racism in America and the harsh realities faced by black individuals in positions of power and success. The early morning sun cut through the windows of the Heritage Cafe, a quaint diner tucked between an aging hardware store and a post office in Briarwood, a small southern town just outside Atlanta inside. The faint hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of silverware on porcelain plates. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and bacon grease, a nostalgic warmth that pulled customers in like clockwork every morning. Its checkered floors and red leather booths gave it the charm of a place frozen in time, unchanged, and maybe a little too comfortable in its familiarity. At a corner table by the window, Dr. Samuel Gaines sat with his tablet open, flipping through a set of intricate medical diagrams while his coffee cooled beside him. The soft click of his pen against the screen accompanied his measured breathing as he reviewed pre-op notes for the day's surgeries. Samuel, in his early 40s, was tall and lean, his crisp Oxford shirt rolled at the sleeves, revealing forearms toned from years of steady, precise work. The lines of his face were distinguished rather than weathered, his thoughtful brown eyes framed by black-rimmed glasses that lent him a quiet air of authority. But authority was the furthest thing from Samuel's mind in this moment. The quiet hours before sunrise were his sanctuary, a time when he wasn't the Dr. Samuel Gaines, chief of surgery at Trinity Medical Center, a top-ranking trauma surgeon whose skills had saved hundreds of lives. Here, in the sleepy town diner, he could simply be Sam, the man who liked his eggs over easy, grits with just a pinch of salt, and the occasional slice of peach pie at dawn. A waitress approached his table, her apron smudged with flour and ketchup. Her name tag read Sharon, and she carried herself with the weariness of someone who had already clocked in 10 hours. "Morning, hun," she said with a perfunctory smile. "Refill on the coffee?" "Yes, thank you, Sharon." Samuel smiled warmly, lowering his pen and turning his full attention to her. He made a point to remember names, even here. Especially here. Sharon gave a slight nod as she poured. Her eyes flicked to his tablet screen with curiosity, then back to him. "You working on something fancy over there?" Samuel chuckled softly. "Just reviewing for work. Got a long day ahead." She gave a non-committal, and moved along without pressing further. Samuel wasn't offended. In places like this, a man in dress slacks and an expensive watch who carried himself too quietly often went unnoticed. He preferred it that way. Outside, the cafe door swung open with a sharp jingle. A man in a navy blue sheriff's jacket stepped in, the embroidered star on his chest catching the light. Sheriff Hank Wallace was a fixture of Briarwood, and his thick build filled the doorway before he stomped inside, cowboy boots echoing across the linoleum floor. He tipped his hat toward Sharon, who greeted him cheerfully with a fresh cup. "Anything new out there today, Hank?" "Quiet as ever, Sherry," Hank replied, before tossing a glance across the diner. His gaze landed briefly on Samuel, before continuing without pause. The corner of his mouth twitched with something unreadable, though Samuel didn't miss it. There was something about small-town sheriffs, the way they carried their authority so casually, but wielded it like a hammer. Samuel returned his attention to the diagrams on his screen, but his focus fractured. A snippet of conversation floated over from the next booth where two older gentlemen sat talking, men Samuel had seen before but whose names escaped him. "I saw some of them trucks parked outside Trinity Medical last week," one man muttered, his words just loud enough to carry. "Lot of folks from Atlanta big-shot surgeons coming in, I heard." "Don't need big shots," the other grumbled. "Just somebody who knows how to stitch folks up right and keep the bill down." Samuel's jaw tightened briefly, but he said nothing. He knew those voices too well, the kind that bristled at anything that seemed too much, too new, too out of place. Trinity Medical Center had been revitalized under his leadership. It now boasted cutting-edge equipment and surgeons who flew in from top hospitals to train under him. But for some in Briarwood, change still came too quickly, and resentment followed close behind. A sharp buzz from his phone broke Samuel's train of thought. He glanced at the screen. A text from his assistant, Margaret, flashed across the notification bar. Margaret. Or 3, prepped Dr. Bailey's running 15 mins late. You're needed for consult before first cut ETA. Samuel tapped out a quick response. On my way, 20 minutes. Just as he tucked the phone back into his pocket, a loud voice cut through the cafe's easy hum. Hey you! Samuel's brow furrowed, and he glanced up to see Sheriff Wallace standing near the counter, pointing at him. For a split second, confusion crossed Samuel's face. Something wrong? Samuel asked, keeping his tone calm and measured. Wallace stalked closer, his steps slow and deliberate. Mind telling me why you're sitting in here poking at that computer thing like you own the place? The room fell unusually quiet. Sharon stopped mid-pour, her eyes darting nervously between the sheriff and Samuel. The two men in the next booth exchanged knowing looks, the kind that said, "Here we go." Samuel set his pen down carefully and looked up at the sheriff, his face neutral but firm. I don't see the problem, Sheriff. I'm having breakfast before I head to work. Is there an issue? Hank Wallace tilted his head, his gaze narrowing like a predator sizing up prey. You a lawyer or something? Samuel's lips quirked in the faintest hint of irony. No. Out-of-town contractor? No. Hank snorted. Figures y'all big city folks blow through towns like this acting like you're smarter than the rest of us. Ain't nobody fooled. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Samuel held Wallace's gaze, unflinching, even as the sheriff's voice thickened with disdain. He recognized the tone, a familiar mix of suspicion and authority that too often bled into something darker. I'm not here to cause any trouble, Sheriff, Samuel said evenly, his voice unwavering. Just here for breakfast, same as you. Well, Hank huffed, we'll see about that. He turned sharply, returning to his coffee at the counter, but the damage had been done. Conversations throughout the cafe had quieted to whispers. Sharon returned briefly to Samuel's table, her hands trembling as she topped off his cup. Sorry about that, she murmured under her breath. Hank's been in a mood lately. Samuel offered her a small, understanding smile. It's fine, I've dealt with worse. And he had. Plenty worse. Years of operating rooms, life and death decisions, and the occasional microaggressions that followed him even into his position of prominence, had taught Samuel to keep his composure. But this small-town cafe moment, was something else. It was quieter, more insidious, and yet equally exhausting. He paid his check, leaving a generous tip, and walked toward the door. Sheriff Wallace's eyes followed him as he passed, heavy with unspoken challenge. Outside, the crisp morning air hit Samuel's face, refreshing him as he loosened his tie. At that moment, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Margaret. Margaret. Waiting on you and pre-op patient in OR 3. Stable Bailey just arrived. You good? Samuel stared at the message, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He thought of the sheriff's words, of the men in the booth, of the silent judgment that clung to him like morning fog. Finally he replied, Yes, I'm good on my way. As Samuel slid into his black Audi and started the engine, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. Calm, steady, determined. The man they couldn't see in the diner was the same man who would save a life within the hour. And that, Samuel thought, was all the truth he needed. The black Audi glided through Briarwood's quiet streets, its engine a low hum against the morning stillness. Samuel's grip on the steering wheel was steady, his posture impeccable, but the tension sat beneath the surface like a fault line ready to crack. He replayed the diner scene in his mind, the sheriff's pointed words echoing louder now that the moment had passed. Y'all big city folks act like you're smarter than the rest of us. It wasn't the first time Samuel had been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. But something about the quiet bite of small-town suspicion always hit differently, more personal, like a needle prick just beneath the skin. He let out a slow breath as his hospital came into view. Trinity Medical Center rose from the edge of town, like a sleek modern giant amid modest suburban surroundings. The hospital's glass facade reflected the morning light, a symbol of the progress Samuel had fought to bring to a community reluctant to embrace change. As he pulled into his designated spot, a perk of his title, he spotted a cluster of hospital staff huddled near the entrance. Among them was Dr. Gregory Bailey, one of Trinity's senior surgeons. Gregory was in his 50s, with thinning silver hair and a habit of rolling up his scrubs to his knees, like a tennis player perpetually ready for a match. Beside him stood Mark Tillman, Trinity's new head of administration, a stocky man with sharp features who had transferred from a smaller regional hospital only 2 months ago. Samuel didn't like Tillman, not because he was new, but because there was something about him that bristled whenever Samuel spoke. Mark always seemed to smile too tightly when Samuel presented ideas at board meetings, as though humoring him instead of respecting him. "Morning, gentlemen," Samuel greeted as he approached, his voice smooth as ever. Gregory offered a brief nod while Mark's smile appeared, tight, shallow, and insincere. "Morning, Dr. Gaines," Mark replied. "Running a little late today, are we?" Samuel's brow furrowed at the unnecessary comment. He glanced at his watch, 7:45 a.m., precisely on time. "No, Mark, right on schedule." Gregory cleared his throat, clearly eager to change the subject. "We've got a busy day ahead, Sam. The OR is ready for the aneurysm repair in room 3. "Thank you, Greg," Samuel replied. He turned toward the glass doors, but Mark fell into step beside him, matching his pace. "You know, Dr. Gaines," Mark began, his tone casual, but tinged with something sharper. "I was reviewing the quarterly reports last night. Trinity's seen some impressive growth under your leadership." "Thank you," Samuel said cautiously. Compliments from Mark always came with strings attached. "But with all these upgrades and big city surgeons coming in, some of the locals have been raising concerns," Mark continued, his voice dropping just slightly. "You know how communities like this feel about too much outside influence." Samuel stopped walking and turned to face him, his calm veneer still intact. "If by outside influence you mean better care, life-saving technology, and opportunities for young doctors to train in modern facilities, then I'd say that influence is worth embracing, wouldn't you?" Mark's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. "Of course, just something to keep in mind. It's important to, fit in when you're leading a place like this." Samuel's stomach turned. The message was clear. Know your place. Don't outshine the locals. Don't make too many waves, but Samuel didn't bite. Instead, he simply nodded, a polite mask firmly in place. "I appreciate the advice, Mark," he said evenly, before turning toward the elevators. Inside the operating room, Samuel found his rhythm as he always did. The patient, a 50-year-old man with a life-threatening aortic aneurysm, was prepped and sedated on the table. The beeping monitors and sterile hum of ventilators formed a symphony Samuel knew by heart. He adjusted his gloves, feeling the steady calm settle over him as the scrub nurse, Rachel, handed him the first instrument. "Scalpel." "Yes, doctor." The world outside the OR faded away as Samuel focused on the delicate task at hand. His movements were precise, practiced, each incision a decision calculated down to the millimeter. Here, in the sterile sanctum of the operating room, his authority wasn't questioned. It was earned with every life he saved. "Clamp," he ordered softly. The hours passed in orchestrated concentration, the team moving in perfect sync under his direction. After surgery, Samuel retreated to his office to finish charting. He barely had time to remove his cap when a knock sounded at the door. "Come in," Samuel said. The door opened and a young nurse entered. Bethany, one of the newer hires. Her face was flushed with nerves as she held a clipboard tightly to her chest. "Dr. Gaines," she started timidly. "There's a situation down in the ER. A patient's family member is refusing treatment until they speak to, well, a different doctor." Samuel blinked. "What's the issue?" Bethany shifted awkwardly. "They're asking for someone else. They don't think you're qualified." The room fell silent for a beat. Samuel's heart sank, not out of surprise, but out of sheer exhaustion at hearing the same implication again. The polite phrasing was always the same, but the meaning never changed. Samuel pushed back his chair and stood, straightening his coat. "I'll handle it." Bethany nodded quickly, stepping aside as Samuel swept past her. The ER was chaotic. As always, patients on gurneys lined the hall, nurses moved with clinical efficiency, and the air buzzed with activity. Near the triage desk stood a man in his late 60s, his face pinched with irritation. Beside him sat a younger woman, his daughter, Samuel presumed, whose eyes darted nervously between her father and the approaching doctor. Samuel stepped forward, his posture calm and upright. "Good afternoon, I'm Dr. Gaines. How can I help you today?" The older man turned sharply, his gaze sweeping Samuel up and down. His lip curled slightly, though he masked it quickly. "You're the one who's supposed to be treating my wife?" "Yes, sir," Samuel replied evenly. "I've been updated on her condition, and I'm here to make sure she gets the best care possible." The man snorted. "Don't think so, I want someone else." Samuel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained smooth. "May I ask why?" The man's eyes narrowed. "No offense, but we're not comfortable. We'd prefer someone with more experience." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "I assure you, sir, I've been a practicing trauma surgeon for over a decade. Your wife is in very capable hands." The man's daughter shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, let's just—" "No." The older man cut her off sharply. "I said, no, I'm not taking any chances. Get me the head doctor." "I am the head doctor," Samuel said quietly, though the weight of his words hung heavy between them. The man stared at him, his disbelief practically radiating off him. "You?" "Yes." Samuel held his gaze, his tone unwavering. "And while you're standing here refusing care, your wife is waiting for the treatment she needs." The man opened his mouth to retort, but his daughter suddenly stepped in. "That's enough, Dad," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. She turned to Samuel. "I'm sorry, Dr. Gaines. Please, help her." Samuel inclined his head. "Of course." Without another word, he stepped past them toward the triage area, leaving the father standing there, red-faced and sputtering. Back in the hallway, Samuel exhaled slowly, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The weight of moments like these, the constant reminders of the world's prejudices, settled on his shoulders like bricks. He had spent his entire life proving himself, every achievement carefully built to silence the voices of doubt. Yet it never seemed to be enough. "How much more do I have to give?" But even as the thought crossed his mind, Samuel straightened his shoulders. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "You carry yourself with dignity, Samuel. No one can take that from you unless you let them." He walked back to his office with his head held high, the day's weight temporarily at bay. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Briarwood's cracks were starting to show, and sooner or later, something, or someone, was going to push him too far. Samuel was halfway through his third patient consultation of the afternoon when the knock came at his office door. It was firm, deliberate, and Samuel recognized the underlying tension before the door even opened. "Come in," he said, his voice calm but wary. The door swung open, and Mark Tillman stepped inside, flanked by 2 police officers. Samuel's brows furrowed at the unexpected entourage. The officers, both white, stood rigid, their hands resting near their utility belts, as though Samuel posed an unspoken threat. "Dr. Gaines," Mark said, his tone clipped and formal. "I need you to come with us." Samuel closed the file in front of him and sat back in his chair, scanning the room with slow precision. "Care to explain what this is about?" The younger officer, a man in his early 30s with sharp blue eyes, took a step forward. "We received a report about stolen prescription narcotics connected to this hospital. We need to ask you some questions." Samuel's expression didn't flicker, though something cold began to coil in his chest. "Stolen narcotics?" He glanced at Mark. "And what does that have to do with me?" "We have reason to believe the drugs were removed under your credentials," Mark interjected, avoiding Samuel's direct gaze. "It's protocol to involve law enforcement." Samuel remained silent for a beat, studying Mark. He caught the telltale signs of discomfort, the slight sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his fingers twitched against his clipboard. Something wasn't adding up. "Let me get this straight," Samuel said slowly, his voice even but firm. "You're accusing me of stealing prescription narcotics, without evidence?" The senior officer, who had remained quiet, stepped in. "This isn't an arrest, Dr. Gaines. We just need you to come with us for questioning. It'll go smoother if you cooperate." Samuel stood, straightening his shoulders, his voice razor-sharp. "I have nothing to hide." The officers exchanged glances, as if silently affirming that this was the response they'd expected. The younger officer stepped forward again, hand twitching near his cuffs. "We'll need you to leave with us now, sir." As they walked through the hospital hallways, Samuel was acutely aware of every eye on him. Staff whispered behind their hands. Nurses averted their gazes. Even Gregory Bailey, who passed by on his way to the OR, offered little more than a hesitant glance before quickly looking away. Samuel kept his head high, his spine straight, though his mind churned like a storm. "This is ridiculous," he said softly, glancing toward Mark, who trailed alongside the officers with an air of strained authority. "And you know it." "Just following protocol," Mark muttered, avoiding Samuel's gaze. Samuel clenched his jaw. Protocol. It was always the excuse. An invisible wall to shield prejudice behind rules and procedure. They exited through the ER's sliding glass doors, where a black and white patrol car waited. The officers ushered Samuel into the back seat, the doors slamming shut with a finality that sent an ache through his chest. Outside, patients and bystanders had gathered in small clusters, their murmurs a low hum of gossip. Samuel's eyes fell on Bethany and Rachel, who stood frozen near the entrance. Rachel looked visibly shaken, her hand clasped tightly to her chest. Bethany bit her lip, guilt flashing across her face. Samuel inhaled deeply, forcing himself to remain composed. He couldn't let them see him crumble. Not now. At the police station, Samuel sat in a small, drab interrogation room, its fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The walls were bare, the air thick with silence. Across from him sat Officer Daniels, the same young officer who'd escorted him from the hospital. Daniels leaned back in his chair, a smug air about him as he pushed a folder across the table. "Do you recognize these records?" Samuel glanced down at the papers, printed reports of narcotics logged under his credentials over the past 3 weeks. His name appeared repeatedly, listed as the authorized physician. Samuel frowned, his voice calm. "Those aren't my entries." Daniels arched a brow. "You expect us to believe that?" "Yes," Samuel replied firmly. "Any doctor will tell you that hospital systems can be accessed with stolen logins. I've already raised concerns about our security protocols in the past." Daniels smirked, clearly unimpressed. Convenient excuse. Samuel clenched his fists beneath the table, but refused to rise to the bait. "If you're looking for answers, check the security logs. My schedule speaks for itself. I've been in surgeries and patient consults every day. You'll see exactly when and where I logged in." Daniels ignored him, flipping to another page of the report. "And what about witnesses, Dr. Gaines, anyone who can confirm where you were during these log entries?" Samuel's patience thinned. "I've been at work all day. Every day. My staff can verify that." Daniels leaned forward, the smugness in his expression deepening. "Maybe. But the fact remains, doctor, that someone used your name? That's pretty damning, wouldn't you say?" Samuel stared at him, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He'd faced prejudice before, plenty of it. But there was something insidious about this. The insinuation was more than a casual microaggression. This was calculated personal. Before Samuel could respond, the door creaked open, and another officer entered. It was Sergeant Mitchell, an older man with a gruff demeanor who carried a faint whiff of fairness. Samuel wasn't sure he trusted yet. "Daniels, give us a minute," Mitchell said. Daniels scowled but stood, shooting Samuel one last look before leaving the room. Mitchell shut the door and sank into the seat opposite Samuel, sighing heavily. "Dr. Gaines, you're a respected man. Nobody wants to believe you'd do something like this." "I didn't," Samuel said simply, his voice low but steady. Mitchell studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth. "Look," he said finally, "I'm no fool. Someone wants to make you look bad. Maybe because of your position, maybe because of something else. But right now, your name's tied to missing drugs. That's a problem." Samuel leaned forward. "Then fix it. Look into the logins. Talk to IT. I've been set up, and if you dig even a little, you'll see that." Mitchell sighed again, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll see what I can do." "That's not good enough," Samuel shot back, surprising even himself with the force of his words. "You will look into it, because if you don't, I will, and I'll make damn sure the truth comes out." Mitchell's brow shot up, but he didn't argue. He stood slowly, as if conceding the point. "Sit tight, Dr. Gaines." Hours passed before Samuel was released. It wasn't an apology, merely a stiff declaration that they had no grounds for holding him. At this time, Samuel's stomach burned with frustration as he exited the station, only to find a familiar car waiting outside. Gregory Bailey stepped out of his silver sedan, his face lined with worry. "Sam." Samuel's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his exhaustion weighed heavy. "Greg." "I heard what happened," Gregory said. "It's all over. The hospital staff's in a panic." Samuel sighed. "It's a setup." Gregory frowned. "Who would do something like this?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "Someone who doesn't want me there." Gregory studied him, his expression conflicted. "Sam, I don't know what's happening, but you've got allies in that hospital. People who believe in you. Don't let them win." Samuel's lips quirked into a humorless smile. "They won't." That night, Samuel sat alone in his dimly lit study, staring at his laptop screen. The hospital's login records flashed before him, each entry a time-stamped accusation that didn't match his schedule. Someone was framing him, and he was done playing defense. With a resolute breath, Samuel picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Tasha," he said, when the line picked up, his voice firm. "I need your help." Tasha Green was a relentless attorney and an old college friend. If anyone could peel back the layers of this mess, it was her. "What's going on?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. Samuel glanced at the hospital records on his screen, then out the window into the darkened streets of Briarwood. "Someone just made the worst mistake of their life," he said quietly. The following morning, Samuel stood in front of the hospital entrance. The same sliding glass doors that had welcomed him countless times now felt like an invisible wall, daring him to cross into a place where his reputation hung by a thread. Whispers had already circulated: stolen narcotics, police involvement, words sharp enough to slice through the respect he had spent decades earning. He inhaled deeply, adjusting the crisp cuffs of his navy suit. Today, he would take back control of the narrative. Samuel strode through the lobby with his signature calm, every step deliberate. The murmurs were louder this time, faces turning as he passed. Some curious, others skeptical, and a few blatantly hostile. He spotted Gregory Bailey standing near the nurse's station, mid-conversation with Rachel, but both fell silent when they saw him. "Sam," Gregory called softly, breaking the tense silence. "Good morning," Samuel replied, his tone professional. Rachel gave a faint nod, but he caught the hesitation in her eyes. Gregory leaned in. "Mitchell's been digging through the security logs, nothing yet, but he says he'll keep at it." "There's pressure from above," Gregory said in a low voice. "Pressure?" Samuel's eyes narrowed. "What kind of pressure?" Gregory rubbed his chin, lowering his voice further. "Tillman's pushing to suspend you pending further investigation, says it's hospital policy." Samuel's jaw tightened. Tillman. The weasel had been circling since day one, making thinly veiled comments about Samuel's privileged position and modern quotas. It was infuriating, but Samuel refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. "I'm not going anywhere, Greg," Samuel said firmly. "If they want a fight, they'll get one." In the staff conference room, Samuel stood at the head of the table, his presence filling the space despite the weight of what was at stake. He had called this meeting himself, a bold move considering the scrutiny. But Samuel knew the only way to confront a smear campaign was head-on. Around the table sat department heads, senior nurses, and hospital board members, including Mark Tillman, who perched smugly at the far end. His icy blue eyes locked onto Samuel, silently daring him to falter. Samuel began, his voice calm and clear. "As you're all aware, there's been an accusation that stolen narcotics were logged under my credentials. I'm here to state unequivocally that I have not, ever misused my authority." "Then how do you explain it?" Tillman interrupted, his tone sharp. Samuel met his gaze directly. "I can't yet. But what I do know is that our system isn't as secure as you'd like to believe. I've been raising concerns about login vulnerabilities for months, and as of now, I have a cybersecurity team combing through those records." "You brought in outside help?" Tillman snapped, his voice tinged with alarm. "That's highly irregular." "What's irregular?" Samuel countered, his tone measured. "Is a man's career being dragged through the mud without evidence. If you're confident in this hospital's security, then you should have no problem with an audit." A murmur passed through the room. Several heads turned toward Tillman, waiting for his response. He hesitated, just long enough for Samuel to press further. I've also reached out to legal counsel to ensure my rights are protected during this investigation. He turned his gaze to the board members. For over 20 years, I've served this hospital with nothing but integrity. I don't intend to let baseless accusations tarnish what I've built. Gregory, seated near the middle, gave an approving nod. Others looked conflicted, nervous even, but the tide had begun to shift. Samuel could see it. He wasn't fighting alone. I suggest we wait until the audit results come in before making any decisions, Samuel concluded, his voice steady. Tillman, cornered but unwilling to back down, leaned forward with a smirk. This doesn't change the fact that your name is all over those records. Someone must have used your credentials, Dr. Gaines. But the question remains. Why yours? The insinuation hung heavy in the room, a thinly veiled accusation. Samuel's fingers curled around the edge of the table, his patience fraying. Because I'm visible, Samuel said sharply, his eyes blazing as they met Tillman's. I'm visible in ways that make some people uncomfortable. You know it, and so do I. The room fell silent. Samuel straightened his shoulders, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. I won't be made an example of for someone else's agenda. The tension didn't ease as Samuel walked through the hospital corridors. Each step echoed in his mind like a countdown. Something was coming. Something bigger. He felt it. At his office door, Samuel stopped cold. The door was ajar. Heart pounding, he pushed it open slowly, his breath catching as the scene unfolded before him. His meticulously organized office was a wreck, papers scattered across the floor, drawers hanging open. His computer monitor was blank, a black void where his work used to be, and on his desk sat a single orange bottle, its label partially ripped. Narcotics. Samuel picked it up, his pulse roaring in his ears. Whoever had done this wasn't even trying to hide it now. This wasn't just an accusation, it was a setup, a message. Dr. Gaines? Rachel's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned sharply, bottle still in hand, and saw her standing in the doorway, her expression torn between confusion and fear. What happened? She asked softly. Samuel exhaled, forcing his voice to steady. Someone broke in. Rachel took a hesitant step forward, her eyes flicking to the bottle in his hand. Is that? It's planted, Samuel said firmly, setting it down with deliberate care. I need you to call security and report this. Rachel nodded, pulling out her phone, but her hands trembled slightly. Samuel watched her, his chest tight. Even those closest to him were questioning, am I losing them? That evening, Samuel sat across from Tasha Green in his living room, the coffee table between them strewn with files, hospital records, and cybersecurity reports. This is blatant, Tasha said, flipping through the papers. They're making it personal. They want me gone, Tasha. Someone's pulling the strings. Tasha glanced at him, her sharp gaze unwavering. You've pissed off someone with power, I'll dig, but you need to be ready for this to get worse before it gets better. Samuel leaned back, exhaustion creeping into his bones. How much worse? You know how these things play out, she replied. A black man with power. They'll try to destroy everything you've built just to prove you don't belong. Samuel rubbed his temples. Then we fight back. 2 days later, the breaking point came. Samuel stood in the boardroom again, this time surrounded by hospital officials, Mark Tillman, and 2 police officers, including Officer Daniels Mitchell, the senior officer, stood near the back, his face hard to read. Tillman smirked, rising to his feet. Dr. Gaines, we have evidence suggesting that the narcotics found in your office are part of the missing supply. Samuel stared at him, unflinching. You planted them! Gasps rippled across the room, but Tillman's smirk only widened. Are you accusing the hospital of corruption, doctor? No, Samuel said coldly, his voice filling the room with quiet force. I'm accusing you. Tillman's face reddened. This is absurd! You set me up, Samuel continued, his tone unwavering, and I have the cybersecurity audit to prove it. He turned toward the entrance as the double doors opened, and Tasha walked in with a folder tucked under her arm. Ladies and gentlemen, Tasha announced, her voice sharp, I have proof that Dr. Gaines's credentials were accessed remotely, fraudulently, from an unregistered terminal. Tillman's face froze. Samuel took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Tillman. You underestimated me, and now, the truth is about to come out. The room descended into chaos. Voices raised, board members scrambling for explanations. Tillman sputtered, his confidence unraveling before their eyes. But Samuel didn't hear any of it. His focus was singular now, his resolve hardened. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But Samuel Gaines was ready to burn down every lie, every corrupt thread, to expose the truth. The boardroom buzzed like an open hive, tension pouring from every corner. Reporters, legal advisors, hospital administrators, and police officers filled the space, murmuring in chaotic bursts. Cameras and smartphones recorded the escalating drama as the air crackled with anticipation. Samuel Gaines stood tall at the head of the table, a fortress of calm in the storm, his commanding presence quiet but unyielding. Across from him sat Mark Tillman, his face taut and splotched with red, anger simmering beneath his thin veneer of composure. At the far end of the room, Officer Daniels leaned against the wall, arms crossed, and a smirk etched onto his face. His very posture screamed arrogance, as though the outcome had already been decided. Mitchell, the senior officer, stood beside him, his silence uneasy, his expression hard to read. Samuel scanned the room slowly, his gaze sharp, unwavering. Every glance met him with something different: doubt, pity, judgment, but also a flicker of hope from those who still believed in him. Gregory Bailey, Samuel's closest ally, offered him a small nod, and Tasha Green sat ready at his side with a stack of damning evidence waiting to be revealed. The stakes had never been higher. His career, his integrity, his name. Samuel wouldn't let it end here. This meeting is unnecessary, Tillman barked, slamming his palm onto the table to break the silence. Dr. Gaines has already been implicated. The evidence speaks for itself. Samuel raised an eyebrow, but kept his voice level. Is that so, Mark? I think we should let the real evidence speak first. Tillman opened his mouth to object, but Tasha cut in, her tone sharp. The evidence you've been waving around doesn't tell the whole story. In fact, it's deliberately misleading. What are you talking about? Tillman sneered, though a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Samuel stepped forward, pulling a flash drive from his pocket. This, he said, holding it up, is the cybersecurity report. I had my credentials audited by an independent team. He turned to the tech staff member seated at the far end. If you'd be so kind, please display the findings. The tech assistant hesitated, looking nervously toward Tillman, but when Samuel's gaze landed on him, the man swallowed and connected the drive to the main screen. The boardroom dimmed, and rows of data illuminated the massive monitor at the front. All logins to the hospital system are tracked, Samuel began, pointing to a section on the screen. As you can see here, my credentials were accessed remotely, not from my terminal, but from an unregistered device located off-site. The screen showed timestamps and IP addresses, concrete proof. Murmurs rippled through the room. Tillman's face paled. That doesn't mean... It means, Tasha interrupted coldly, that someone deliberately used Dr. Gaines's login to frame him, and I think we all know why. Samuel turned, his gaze landing on Tillman like a hammer. You've been gunning for me for years, Mark. What did you hope to accomplish? Get me out of your way? Take credit for my work? Or was it simply because I don't look like the kind of man you think deserves to sit in this chair? Tillman bolted upright, his voice shrill. How dare you? Samuel stepped closer, his voice rising but controlled, every word a calculated blow. You don't intimidate me, Mark. I've dealt with men like you my entire life, men who smile in public but work in shadows to tear others down. But you made a mistake, you underestimated me. I don't just stand here, I fight. The room fell silent. Tillman stumbled over his words, sweat beading on his brow. You have no proof that I... Samuel glanced at Tasha, who calmly opened a file and slid it across the table toward the board. Actually, we do. We traced the IP address used to falsify the login. The connection originated from your assistant's laptop, right here, in this building. Gasps erupted. A board member's voice broke the silence. Is this true, Mark? Tillman's face contorted as panic took hold. This is ridiculous. It's a setup, Daniels barked suddenly from the back of the room, pushing off the wall. "This is just a desperate man trying to save his own skin." Samuel turned toward him, his calm giving way to ice. "And you planted the narcotics in my office, didn't you?" Daniels laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Don't throw wild accusations, Doc. If you'd stayed in your lane, none of this would have happened." Samuel's hands clenched, the thin thread of his restraint fraying. "My lane?" Daniels took a step forward, his voice growing louder. "You think you're better than everyone else because you've got a few degrees and a fancy title, but you're no different than the rest of them. Flashy car, nice suits. Acting like you belong. You don't." The mask slipped completely. Daniel's true nature spilled into the room for everyone to see. The smirk, the disdain, the belief that Samuel's success was an affront to men like him. "You're exactly what's wrong with this system," Daniels added, his tone dripping venom. "Always playing the victim while the rest of us—" "Enough!" Samuel's voice cut through the air like a whip. The room froze. All eyes locked on him as he stepped toward Daniels, his gaze blazing. "Your hate doesn't intimidate me," Samuel said, his voice low but fierce. "I've faced men like you before, and I'll face them again. But what I won't do is let you destroy everything I've built because you can't stand the sight of a black man succeeding on his own terms." Daniel's bravado faltered. The weight of Samuel's words pressed against him, exposing every ounce of his small-minded prejudice. Samuel turned to the room, addressing the hospital board. "You see it now. This isn't about stolen narcotics, it's about men like Mark Tillman and Officer Daniels, who let their biases and insecurities turn into weapons against others." His voice carried strength and resolve, reverberating through the room. "But I'm still standing. I will not let this system bury me, and I will not let them bury the truth." Tillman slumped back into his chair, his face ashen, while Daniels remained rooted to the spot, his anger deflating in the face of Samuel's unyielding resolve. As the meeting concluded, the fallout began. Daniels was escorted from the room, his accusations unraveling as Mitchell quietly approached Samuel. "I'll make sure the full investigation happens, Dr. Gaines," Mitchell said, his voice low. "We can't let people like him stay on the force." Samuel nodded but said nothing. His victory was incomplete. The damage had been done, and his name, though defended, would carry scars. Hours later, as Samuel stood outside the hospital, the cool evening air felt heavier than usual. Tasha approached, sliding her phone into her bag. "It's not over," she said softly. "They'll try to spin it, downplay Tillman's role, protect their own." Samuel stared at the hospital entrance, his shoulders square but heavy. "Let them try. I've spent my whole life proving people like them wrong." Tasha smiled faintly. "You'll survive this, Sam, and when you do, you'll be stronger." Samuel exhaled slowly, the weight of the day pressing on him. He looked out at the horizon, where the last light of the sun bled into darkness. It wasn't over, but Samuel Gaines was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was packed, a murmur of hushed voices vibrating off the marble walls like an unrelenting current. Reporters, community leaders, hospital staff, and supporters squeezed into the gallery, their faces a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Cameras hovered like vultures over the proceedings, every lens pointed at the man seated in the defendant's chair. Dr. Samuel Gaines. He sat tall, his hands folded neatly in front of him, dressed in a tailored navy suit and crisp white shirt that spoke of quiet authority. His calm composure only highlighted the storm swirling around him, a storm fueled by scandal, manufactured lies, and deeply ingrained prejudice. At the prosecution's table sat Officer Daniels, flanked by his lawyer, and a small group of smug police colleagues who offered him encouraging pats on the back. Daniels' expression oozed arrogance, a smirk dancing on his lips as if he'd already won. The stakes were clear. Samuel's career, his reputation, and his freedom were all on the line. Daniels had spun his false narrative perfectly. Claims of Samuel's uncooperative behavior, fabricated accusations of stolen narcotics, and hints that Samuel's foundation might have financial irregularities. It was a deliberate attack on Samuel's name, crafted to tear down everything he'd built. But Samuel had come prepared. "Your Honor," Samuel's lawyer, Tasha Green, stood confidently as she adjusted her blazer. "Before we continue with Officer Daniels' testimony, I'd like to present new evidence to the court." Daniel's smirk faltered slightly, but he masked it by leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. "Proceed," Judge Garcia said, her tone sharp and no nonsense. Tasha turned toward the gallery. "We have obtained surveillance footage from Dr. Gaines's office and access logs from the hospital IT department. They'll demonstrate not only that Dr. Gaines's credentials were compromised, but also that Officer Daniels has deliberately falsified his report to cover his own misconduct." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Daniels's face tightened. Samuel's jaw clenched as he watched the monitors in the courtroom flicker to life. The footage showed his office, empty, at the precise time the alleged narcotics theft occurred. Next, the screen switched to hospital server logs, the digital timestamps crystal clear. The access to Samuel's credentials had come from an external device, Daniels's personal laptop, authenticated through a recovered IP address. The room fell into stunned silence. Daniels's attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant." "It's extremely relevant," Tasha fired back. "It shows my client has been framed, and we are now looking at a blatant abuse of power." The judge overruled the objection, her eyes narrowing on Daniels. "Mr. Daniels, you will explain this to the court. I suggest you choose your words carefully." Daniels shot to his feet, his cocky bravado replaced by a sharp edge of panic. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice rising. "That footage doesn't prove anything Gaines is trying to manipulate." Samuel stood. The room stilled. He turned to face Daniels directly, his voice clear, steady, and cutting through the tension like a blade. "Enough." Daniels froze. Samuel's gaze locked on him, unyielding, resolute. "For weeks, you've lied. For weeks, you've tried to destroy everything I've built, not because I did anything wrong, but because you couldn't stand seeing someone like me in a position of power. Someone like me driving through a neighborhood you thought I didn't belong in. Someone like me building hospitals instead of tearing people down." Daniels scoffed, but his voice wavered. "That's not what this is about." "It's exactly what this is about." Samuel stepped closer to the stand, his voice rising with each word. "You profiled me that night, you planted evidence to cover your actions, and then, when you realized who I was, you decided you'd tear me down because the truth, my success, threatens the small, narrow world you've built for yourself." Daniel's face turned crimson. "I don't have to listen to this." "You will listen," Samuel said firmly, his voice a mix of power and pain. "Because this isn't just about me. It's about every person you've treated like they're invisible. It's about the damage you've done to communities who are tired of being dismissed and mistreated by people like you." Daniel's eyes darted to the judge, who watched with cold scrutiny, her gavel poised but unmoving. Sweat glistened on his forehead. Samuel turned to the gallery, his voice reaching everyone in the room. "For years, I've fought for equality, for dignity, for justice, for people who've been told they're less. I've built hospitals for communities that didn't have care. I've given scholarships to kids who were told their dreams didn't matter. I've spent my life trying to lift others up." His voice softened, but the fire in his tone burned brighter. "And yet, to you, I was just another black man in a nice car, another target, another opportunity to remind someone of their place." Daniels looked like he wanted to disappear. Samuel stepped back and turned to Judge Garcia. "Your Honor, I've spent my life fighting injustice, and today, I ask this court to recognize what's happening here. Corruption, prejudice, and a deliberate attempt to silence me." The judge's sharp gaze shifted to Daniels. "Officer Daniels, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Daniels looked around the courtroom, at the glares of the gallery, at his lawyer, at the cameras capturing every moment his lips opened. But no words came. Finally, he sank back into his seat, his face a mask of defeat. The aftermath of the hearing unfolded quickly. Officer Daniels was suspended. Pending an internal investigation, Tasha had already begun building civil suits against the department for misconduct. And Samuel, though victorious, couldn't shake the weight pressing against his chest as the crowd dispersed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, their voices a flurry of questions. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, but Samuel barely registered it. "Dr. Gaines, do you feel vindicated? What's your next move? Do you think this case will spark systemic change?" Samuel raised a hand, quieting the crowd. This isn't just about me, he said, exhaustion lining his face. Today, one truth was exposed, but there are countless others still buried. We have work to do. He turned to walk away, Tasha falling into step beside him. That was a hell of a fight, Sam, she said softly. It's not over, Samuel murmured, glancing back at the courthouse. It never is. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting the city in hues of deep gold and shadow, Samuel's silhouette stood tall against the horizon, a man still standing, still fighting, and still unbroken. The courthouse steps were quiet now, emptied of the throngs of reporters and spectators. The cool evening breeze rustled Samuel's suit jacket as he stood beside Tasha, watching the orange hues of the sunset stretch across the city skyline. There was a stillness in the air, but the kind that comes after a storm, temporary, fragile, and filled with unspoken questions about what comes next. Looks like Daniels's days in uniform are over, Tasha said, a note of satisfaction in her voice as she scrolled through her phone. He resigned this afternoon. Internal Affairs confirmed they're pursuing full disciplinary action. His badge, gun, and pension are on the line. Samuel let out a quiet breath, a mix of relief and sadness. Daniels's fall wasn't something to celebrate. It was the inevitable outcome of years of unchecked behavior coming to a head. For Samuel, justice wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. And the hospital board? Samuel asked, his tone more subdued. Tasha smiled faintly. The board has formally cleared you of all wrongdoing. In fact, they're begging you to come back. They're calling you essential to the institution. Funny how quickly they change their tune when public opinion turns. Samuel chuckled softly, shaking his head. Typical, I'll think about it. There's more I want to do before I go back to surgeries. The laughter faded, and for a moment, both stood in silence, absorbing the weight of everything that had happened. The lies, the injustice, the fight. It had nearly cost Samuel his career and reputation, but he had walked through the fire and come out stronger. Tasha tucked her phone into her pocket and turned to him. You did something incredible today, Sam. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been silenced, profiled, or overlooked. Samuel met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. It's not enough, Tasha. This isn't just one officer or one incident. It's a system. Daniels was exposed. But how many others like him are still out there? How many people don't get to fight back like I did? Tasha nodded, her eyes reflecting the same determination. So, what are you going to do about it? A quiet resolve settled over Samuel, and he looked out at the city below. I'm going to make sure people don't feel powerless. Daniel's resignation isn't the end. It's a beginning. Weeks later. The gymnasium buzzed with nervous energy. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the room, filled with families, students, community leaders, and off-duty officers. Banners for the Gaines Justice Initiative hung from the walls, the bold lettering announcing the program's mission, advancing fairness, equality, and accountability. Samuel stood backstage, watching the crowd assemble. It felt different than the courtroom. This wasn't a battleground. It was a starting line. Dr. Gaines, we're ready for you, a volunteer said, giving him a small smile. He stepped onto the stage as the murmurs died down. A spotlight followed his steps, illuminating him as he stood before the crowd, calm and confident. He could see familiar faces, parents from his foundation's scholarship program, nurses he'd worked with, police officers curious but guarded, and rows of young people looking for hope. Samuel cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the room. Good evening, everyone. I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for showing up, for being part of the conversation. Conversations like this one are long overdue. A ripple of applause rose, soft but sincere. Samuel smiled faintly before continuing. I didn't want to be here at first. I wanted to stay in my operating room, focused on saving lives one surgery at a time. But life has a way of pushing you out of your comfort zone, forcing you to face truths you'd rather ignore. He paused, letting the words settle. A few months ago, I was handcuffed in my own office, falsely accused, profiled, targeted. Not because of who I am, but because of what I look like. That's not new for people like me. What's new is what happened after we fought back. We stood up, and we won. The applause was louder this time, mixed with murmurs of agreement. But this is just one victory in a much larger fight, Samuel continued, his tone firm but measured. The Gaines Justice Initiative isn't about me. It's about accountability for the people sworn to protect us. It's about empowering communities that have been ignored for too long. It's about building trust, dismantling harmful systems, and creating real change. He pointed to the banners hanging behind him. Our initiative will focus on 3 things: community education, legal advocacy, and police reform. We'll offer free workshops that teach families their rights, create legal resources for people wrongfully targeted, and push for transparency in law enforcement practices. A wave of applause rippled through the room as Samuel stepped back, giving space for the audience's response. He could see the spark of hope in their eyes, the realization that things could change, not overnight, but over time, with work and collective effort. As the applause quieted, Samuel added, "And to those who say this can't be done, that the system is too big, too ingrained, I say this: we are proof that change is possible. Not easy, but possible. We can no longer be silent when injustice happens in plain sight." The room erupted into applause, and this time it didn't stop. As the crowd dispersed, people approached Samuel with handshakes, gratitude, and quiet stories of their own struggles. A young boy clung to his mother's leg as she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Dr. Gaines. My brother went through the same thing years ago, but he didn't have the means to fight back. You're giving people like us hope." Samuel crouched down to the boy's level, offering him a reassuring smile. "What's your name, buddy?" "Micah," the boy said softly. "Well, Micah, always remember this: you're stronger than you think, and your voice matters. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." The boy smiled shyly, clutching his mother's hand as they walked away. Nearby, Samuel spotted Mitchell standing awkwardly by the refreshment table. The officer looked different in civilian clothes, smaller, less sure of himself. Samuel approached him, and Mitchell straightened, clearing his throat. "Dr. Gaines," Mitchell began, shifting on his feet. I wanted to say I'm sorry about everything. Daniels convinced a lot of us to follow his lead, but I should have known better." Samuel studied him for a moment before nodding. "You were part of the problem. Now be part of the solution." Mitchell swallowed hard and nodded. "I will. That's why I came tonight." That night, Samuel stood on the balcony of his home, the city stretching endlessly before him. The stars blinked faintly in the dark sky, a reminder of how vast the world was and how small his struggles might seem in comparison. But tonight, the weight felt lighter. Tasha's voice crackled over the phone. "The press is already buzzing about tonight. You're making waves, Sam." He smiled faintly. "Let them buzz. This isn't about headlines." "Maybe not," Tasha replied. "But sometimes headlines lead to change. Get some rest. You've earned it." After they hung up, Samuel leaned against the railing, letting the cool air wash over him. His mind drifted back to the moments leading up to this point. The arrest, the humiliation, the anger. None of it had broken him. If anything, it had strengthened him. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But now, he wasn't fighting alone. As the breeze picked up, Samuel closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "We're just getting started." The morning light streamed through Samuel Gaines's window, spilling across his neatly made bed and casting a golden glow over his study. The quiet hum of the city waking up drifted in from outside. Samuel sat in his leather armchair, a steaming cup of coffee warming his palms. A journal lay open on the side table, its pages blank save for the title scribbled at the top, "The Fight for Tomorrow." It was the first morning in weeks he had allowed himself to slow down, to simply be. There was a new calmness in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that the battles of the past months had begun to yield something greater than justice for himself. A ripple of change that reached further than he could have imagined. Samuel leaned back, staring out at the skyline. His thoughts wandered back to everything that had brought him to this point. The arrest had been humiliating. The memory of Officer Daniels's voice, sharp, dismissive, judgmental, still etched into Samuel's mind like a scar. He could still hear the clatter of his belongings hitting the floor, feel the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. But even in that moment, stripped of his authority and his dignity, he hadn't lost his sense of self. "I am more than this," he had told himself. "They cannot define me. What Samuel had come to realize in the weeks that followed was how often others didn't get to say those words, how too many were silenced, mistreated, and forgotten because of systemic failures and unchecked bias. That single incident, so glaring and unjust, had become the tipping point for Samuel, a moment that could have broken him, but instead pushed him towards something greater. He thought about Daniel's fall, about the outrage and the investigations that had followed. The officer had resigned, yes, but his departure wasn't a victory, it was merely a symptom of a much deeper sickness. One resignation wouldn't erase the harm done to others, or dismantle the biases embedded into systems meant to protect. Samuel understood now that his fight wasn't against one man or one department. It was against something much larger, against an entrenched mentality that, for too long, had allowed prejudice to go unchecked. And yet, as much as he fought for justice, Samuel refused to become bitter. His mother had taught him that strength wasn't about meeting hatred with hatred, it was about rising above it and inspiring others to follow. The launch of the Gaines Justice Initiative had marked the first tangible step toward change. Samuel still remembered standing on that stage, looking out at the diverse crowd, parents, students, officers, activists, all united by a shared hope. His voice had carried through the room like a call to arms. We cannot change the past, but we can shape the future. We can create systems where justice is not reserved for the privileged, where accountability isn't optional, and where trust can finally begin to heal the wounds left behind. That night, as the crowd erupted in applause, Samuel had felt something stir inside him, a sense of purpose so clear and profound that it silenced all lingering doubts. Since then, the initiative had begun to take root. Families attended workshops where they learned their legal rights. Police officers participated in sensitivity training that emphasized accountability and community building. Samuel had even partnered with local organizations to push for policies requiring transparency in law enforcement. It was slow work, exhausting work. But for the first time, Samuel felt as though he wasn't just repairing the damage, he was building something stronger in its place. Tasha's voice echoed in his mind from the night before. You're becoming a symbol, Sam. People are looking to you to lead. He had laughed then, brushing off the comment. I'm not a leader, he'd said. I'm just doing what's right. But deep down, Samuel understood what she meant. His story had resonated because it wasn't unique. It was shared by so many others who lacked the resources or platform to fight back. By standing up, by refusing to be silenced, Samuel had given others permission to hope, to believe that change was possible. And change was happening. The Gaines Justice Initiative had gained traction across the state. Several police departments had reached out, requesting collaborations to improve training programs. Schools had invited Samuel to speak to students about empowerment, bias, and resilience. Other communities, inspired by Samuel's actions, were beginning to hold their leaders accountable. The ripple was spreading. Samuel turned his attention back to the journal on the table. For weeks, he had been meaning to write down his thoughts, a record of the struggle and the lessons learned. He picked up a pen, his hand hovering over the blank page, and began to write. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. It requires vigilance, resilience, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. For too long, we've been told that progress takes time, that change comes in small, quiet steps. But progress doesn't come without action, without voices demanding to be heard. I've learned that strength isn't about never breaking, it's about rising after you fall, about choosing hope when the world offers you nothing but doubt. Samuel paused, letting the words settle before continuing. The events that brought me here could have destroyed me. But instead, they reminded me of my purpose. This fight is bigger than me. It's for the students who fear being stopped for no reason, for the families torn apart by injustice, and for every person who has ever been told they're less than because of the color of their skin. We have a long way to go, but we're not powerless. We can dismantle the systems that harm us. We can replace silence with action, apathy with empathy, and injustice with accountability. Samuel set down the pen and leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Later that afternoon, he stood on his balcony overlooking the city. His city. He watched the streets below, where people bustled about their lives, unaware of how much had changed in such a short time Samuel knew the fight wasn't over. The wounds of the past wouldn't heal overnight. But the work had begun. Tasha's voice rang in his ear again, as if she were standing beside him. "This is bigger than you, Sam." She was right. This was about building a world where no one had to endure what he had. A world where trust, dignity, and justice weren't privileges. They were expectations. Samuel took a deep breath, the air cool against his skin. "We're just getting started," he whispered, the words carrying into the open sky. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the skyline in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel turned back into his home, ready for what came next. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges many. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Because now, he wasn't walking that road alone.